different cultures, our own included, have lost the true account of the way things are. But it hasn't happened all at once. It's been a gradual process, often taking centuries. This process of losing the true story has been slowed down by the fact that the natural world tells part of the story about God. It's as though creation has been speaking truth to the vague echo of truth that each man is born with. Romans chapter 1 verses 19 to 20 says, "They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God." Many groups still retain fragments of the biblical account. There are stories that talk of creation, of a flood, of a time when languages came to be. But as each group turned away from worshipping the one true God and began to replace the truth with their own stories, there was a gradual forgetting and turning away from what they knew to be true, a continuing replacement of truth with fragments of other stories, either their own or from other religions. The stories that people tell to try to make sense of the world are often disjointed and self-contradictory. So how have we, as believers, as a church, responded to this confusion that exists? How have we tried to tell God's story? Well, we've often only added to that confusion, unfortunately, by telling parts of the story, by taking pieces from here and there and assuming the listeners will make a cohesive story out of it all. We might tell a story about Daniel and the lions, then Peter and John healing a lame man, and then we add a sermon from some verses in Luke, and then another one from Nehemiah. And there's been little continuity or sense of historical truth. And many times our listeners come away with no understanding of this even being a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, a narrative of God's actions in real space and time, his story. For people to understand the enormity and significance and truth of the story, we need to tell it from the beginning and then continue on to its conclusion. It is a story that is tied firmly to reality, to history, to real events. It has a progression like any story or narrative does. And it moves from logical cause to effect. Disjointed and confused stories need to be replaced with a comprehensive, seamless story of reality, because that is what it actually is. And the truth must sweep away the fragmented stories that people have come to believe. The way we present God's story needs to demonstrate the difference between people's confused and fragmented views of reality with the historical truth we find in the biblical narrative. Presenting biblical truth with a focus on man's felt needs keeps man at the center of his world and at the center of the story. The other mistake that we can make, and this might be hard for us to consider, is to focus our teaching on man's sinfulness. Now, of course, people need to realize their sinfulness and their need before God. And this should be one of our most important teaching goals. But it isn't the focus, at least initially, of the story. The primary purpose of any Bible teaching should be not ultimately to elevate the sinfulness of man, as important as that is, but to elevate God, to bring glory to him, and to bring out his character through the things he has said and done. This is the purpose for which we're created. This is the purpose of his word. It's his story. 1 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 11 says, "Yours, O Lord, is the greatness, the power, the glory, the victory, and the majesty. Everything in the heavens and on earth is yours, O Lord. And this is your kingdom. We adore you as the one who is over all things." And then remember Romans chapter 11, verse 36. Everything comes from him and exists by his power and is intended for his glory. All glory to him forever and ever. Amen. And Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. For through him God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers, and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through him and for him. And then Revelation 4:11. You are worthy, O Lord our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things and they exist because you created what you pleased. Reality for man can only come into focus when he understands who God is. This is the basis for all truth. We need to tell his story, which focuses on him. Only then can man know who he is and understand the world in which he lives and realize his sinfulness. Proverbs 9:10, familiar verse. The fear of the Lord is the foundation of wisdom. Knowledge of the Holy One results in good judgment. The main focus of our teaching should be the nature and character of God and his glory. As we tell about the fall and the sinfulness of man, the important focus will not be on, so what are you going to do about it? Rather, it will be, okay, listen to the story of what God has done about it. God's word is centered around the story of what God has done about the problem of sin. It is his response to man's rebellion and how he has brought about reconciliation, the plan of salvation. It is about him redeeming, buying back out of sin people who are lost and unable to help themselves. The Bible tells about the coming of the Messiah, God's Son, within a real historical setting and as the fulfillment of God's plan of reconciliation. The whole story has led to this point. It is God's next and greatest action in the ongoing response to the problem of sin. It was certainly the greatest event in all of history, but it was not an isolated event. The story of God's redemption plan begins in the Old Testament and then culminates in the New. When we teach only the last part of the story, there's a great risk that people won't understand. They hear the solution, but they don't understand their true dilemma. Because their fragmented, confused story remains unchallenged, they don't see how the events of Christ's life and death relate to them. It's a story, but not the story. When Christ's life and death are not placed within the historical context, there is a risk of it being seen as just another story among many stories. The cruelty of man, the issue of pain, the question of how a loving God can allow war and suffering, these are things that many people raise as objections to Christianity or remain confused about. The answer to all of these things is interwoven in the biblical narrative. Issues such as these can only be understood within the whole framework, as God, without single exception, acts righteously and justly, but also lovingly and graciously. And the answer to those difficult issues can only be understood when man's depravity is seen in its historical perspective. When people understand that the human condition is a result of the fall and that this was not God's intention for man, but actually the logical result of man turning his back on his Creator and on the purposes for his creation. When we tell the whole story, we are answering people's questions as God has answered them, from the basis of the biblical narrative. We're not presenting a religion or selling our own particular interpretation of the world. And if people choose not to believe, then it's God's story they're rejecting. We should teach so that God's nature is clearly seen through his actions and on the basis of his redemption plan. Then he will be glorified and people will have the opportunity to respond to truth, rather than what they might say is just one religion among many.